Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings from bygone books.
Welcome to Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings by Gary and Ruth from the classic books of Celtic lore and study. Chapter 13 of The Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch.
Chapter 13 Tree and Plant Worship. The Celts had their own cult of trees, but they adopted local cults, Ligurian, Iberian, and others. The Fagus Deus, the divine beech, the Sex Arbor or Sex Arbores of Pyrenean inscriptions, and an anonymous god represented by a conifer on an altar at Toulouse, probably point to a local Ligurian tree cults continued by the Celts into Roman times. Forests were also personified or ruled by a single goddess, the Dea Arduinna of the Ardennes, and Dea Abnoba of the Black Forest. But more primitive ideas prevailed, like that which assigned a whole class of tree divinities to a forest, e.g. the Fatæ Dervones, spirits of the oak woods of northern Italy. Groups of trees, like the Sex Arbores, were venerated, perhaps for their height, isolation, or some other peculiarity. The Celts made their sacred places in dark groves, the trees being hung with offerings or with the heads of victims. Human sacrifices were hung or impaled on trees, for example by the warriors of Boudica. These, like the offerings still placed by the folk on sacred trees, were attached to them because the trees were the abode of spirits or divinities who in many cases had power over vegetation. Pliny said of the Celts, "They esteem nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree on which it grows. But apart from this, they choose oak woods for their sacred groves and perform no sacred rite without using oak branches." Maximus of Tyre also speaks of the Celtic, maybe German, image of Zeus as a lofty oak, and an old Irish glossary gives daur, oak, as an early Irish name for God, and glosses it by Dea, God. The sacred need fire may have been obtained by friction from oak wood, and it's because of the old sacredness of the oak that a piece of its wood is still used as a talisman in Brittany. Other Aillinn folk besides the Celts regarded the oak as a symbol of a high god, of the sun or the sky, but probably this was not its earliest significance. Oak forests were once more extensive over Europe than they are now, and the old tradition that men once lived on acorns has been shown to be well founded by the witness of archaeological finds, e.g. in northern Italy. A people living in an oak region and subsisting in part on acorns might easily take the oak as a representative of the spirit of vegetation or growth. It was long-lived, its foliage was a protection, it supplied food, its wood was used as fuel, and it was thus clearly the friend of man. For these reasons, and because it was the most abiding and living thing men knew, it became the embodiment of the spirits of life and growth. Folklore survivals show that the spirit of vegetation in the shape of his representative was annually slain, while yet in full vigour, that his life might benefit all things and be passed on undiminished to his successor. Hence the oak, or a human being representing the spirit of vegetation, or both together, were burned in the midsummer fires. How then did the oak come to symbolize a god equated with Zeus? Though the equation may be worthless, it is possible that the connection lay in the fact that Zeus and Jupiter had agricultural functions, or that when the equation was made, the earlier spirit of vegetation had become a divinity with functions resembling those of Zeus. The fires were kindled to recruit the sun's life. They were fed with oak wood, and in them an oak or a human victim representing the spirit embodied in the oak was burned. Hence it may have been thought that the sun was strengthened by the fire residing in the sacred oak. It was thus the original storehouse or reservoir of the fire which was from time to time drawn out to feed the sun. The oak thus became the symbol of a bright god also connected with growth. But to judge by folk survivals, the older conception still remained potent, and tree or human victim affected for good all vegetable growth as well as man's life, while at the same time the fire strengthened the sun. Dr. Evans argues that
The original holy object within the central triliths of Stonehenge was a sacred tree.
An oak, image of the Celtic Zeus. The tree and the stones, once associated with ancestor worship, had become symbols of
a more celestial spirit or spirits than those of departed human beings.
But Stonehenge is now proved to have been in existence before the arrival of the Celts. Hence such a cult must have been pre-Celtic, though it may quite well have been adopted by the Celts. Whether this hypothetical cult was practiced by a tribe, a group of tribes, or by a whole people must remain obscure, and indeed it may well be questioned whether Stonehenge was ever more than the scene of some ancestral rites. Other trees, the yew, the cypress, the alder, and the ash, were venerated, to judge by what Lucan relates of the sacred grove at Marseilles. The Irish Druids attributed special virtues to the hazel, rowan, and yew, the wood of which was used in magical ceremonies described in Irish texts. Fires of rowan were lit by the Druids of rival armies, and incantations said over them in order to discomfit the opposing host, and the wood of all these trees is still believed to be efficacious against fairies and witches. The Irish Bile was a sacred tree of great age, growing over a holy well or fort. 5 of them are described in the Dindsenchas, and 1 was an oak, which not only yielded acorns, but nuts and apples. The mythic trees of Elysium had the same varied fruitage, and the reason in both cases is perhaps the fact that when the cultivated apple took the place of acorns and nuts as a food staple, words signifying nut or acorn were transferred to the apple. A myth of trees on which all the fruits grew might then easily arise. Another Irish Bile was a yew described in the poem as a firm, strong god, while such phrases in this poem as word pure man, judgment of origin, spell of knowledge may have some reference to the custom of writing divinations in ogham on rods of yew. The other Bile were ash trees, and from one of them the Fir Bile, men of the tree, were named, perhaps a totem clan. The lives of kings and chiefs appear to have been connected with these trees, probably as representatives of the spirit of vegetation embodied in the tree. And under their shadow they were inaugurated. But as a substitute for the king was slain, so doubtless these preeminent sacred trees were too sacred, too much charged with supernatural force to be cut down and burned, and the yearly ritual would be performed with another tree. But in time of feud, one tribe gloried in destroying the Bile of another, and even in the 10th century, when the Bile Adair was destroyed by Maelocohlen, the act was regarded with horror. But, O reader, this deed did not pass unpunished. Of another Bile, that of Borrisokane, it was said that any house in which a fragment of it was burned would itself be destroyed by fire. Tribal and personal names point to a belief in descent from tree gods or spirits, and perhaps to totemism. The Eburones were the yew tribe people, Eburones. The Bituriges perhaps had the mistletoe for their symbol, and their surname, Vivisci, implies they were called the mistletoe men. If Bile, tree, is connected with the name Bailé, that of the ancestor of the Milesians, this may point to some myth or descent from a sacred tree, as in the case of the Fir Bile, or men of the tree. Other names, like Guidgen, Viduo-genos, son of the tree, Dergen, Dervo-genos, son of the oak, Guerngen, Verno-genos, son of the alder, imply filiation to a tree. Though these names became conventional, they express what had once been a living belief. Names borrowed directly from trees are also found. Eburos or Ebur, meaning yew, Derua or Deroacus, oak, etc. The veneration of trees growing beside burial mounds or megalithic monuments was probably a pre-Celtic cult continued by the Celts. The tree embodied the ghost of the person buried under it, but such a ghost could then hardly be differentiated from a tree spirit or divinity. Even now in Celtic districts, extreme veneration exists for trees growing in cemeteries and in other places. It's dangerous to cut them down or to pluck a leaf or branch from them, while in Breton churchyards the yew is thought to spread a root to the mouth of each corpse. The story of the grave of Cyperissa, daughter of a Celtic king in the Danube region, from which first sprang the mournful cypress, is connected with universal legends of trees growing from the graves of lovers until their branches intertwine. These embody the belief that the spirit of the dead is in the tree, which was thus in all likelihood the object of a cult. Instances of these legends occur in Celtic story. Yew stakes are driven through the bodies of Naisi and Deirdre to keep them apart, became yew trees, the tops of which embraced over Arbor Cathedral. A yew sprang from the grave of Bailé Mac Buain, and an apple tree from that of his lover Aillinn. And the top of each had the form of their heads. The identification of tree and ghost is here complete. The elder, rowan and thorn are still planted round houses to keep off witches, or sprigs of rowan are placed over doorways, a survival from the time when they were believed to be tenanted by a beneficial spirit hostile to evil influences. In Ireland and the Isle of Man, the thorn is thought to be the resort of fairies, and they, like the woodland fairies, or woodmen, are probably representatives of older tree spirits and gods of groves and forests. Tree worship was rooted in the oldest nature worship, and the Church had the utmost difficulty in suppressing it. Councils fulminated against the cult of trees, against offerings to them, or by placing of lights before them and before wells or stones, and against the belief that certain trees were too sacred to be cut down or burned. Heavy fines were levied against those who practised these rites, yet still they continued. Amator, the Bishop of Auxerre, tried to stop the worship of a large pear tree standing in the centre of the town, and on which the semi-Christian inhabitants hung animal heads with much ribaldry. At last St. Germanus destroyed it, but at the risk of his life. St. Martin of Tours was allowed to destroy a temple, but the people would not permit him to attack a much venerated pine tree which stood beside it. An excellent example of the way in which the more official paganism fell before Christianity, while the older religion of the soil from which it sprang could not be entirely eradicated. The Church often effected a compromise. Images of the gods affixed to trees were replaced by those of the Virgin, but with curious results. Legends arose telling how the faithful had been led to such trees, and there discovered the image of the Madonna miraculously placed among the branches. These are analogous to the legends of the discovery of images of the Virgin in the earth, such images being really those of the mattress. Representations of sacred trees are occasionally met on coins, altars, and ex-votos. If the interpretation be correct, which sees a representation of a part of the Cuchulainn legend on the Paris and Trèves altars, the trees figured there would not necessarily be sacred, but otherwise they may depict sacred trees. We now turn to Pliny's account of the mistletoe rite. The Druids held nothing more sacred than this plant and the tree on which it grew, probably an oak. Of it, groves were formed, while branches of the oak were used in all religious rites. Everything growing on the oak had been sent from heaven, and the presence of the mistletoe showed that the god had selected the tree for special favour. Rare as it was, when found, the mistletoe was the object of careful ritual. On the 6th day of the moon, it was culled. Preparations for a sacrifice and feast were made beneath the tree, and 2 white bulls, whose horns had never been bound, were brought there. A druid, clad in white, ascended the tree and cut the mistletoe with a golden sickle. As it fell, it was caught in a white cloth. The bulls were then sacrificed, and the prayer was made that God would make his gift prosperous to those on whom he had bestowed it. The mistletoe was called the universal healer, and a potion made from it caused barren animals to be fruitful. It was also a remedy against all poisons. We can hardly believe that such an elaborate ritual merely led up to the medico-magical use of the mistletoe. Possibly, of course, the rite was an attenuated survival of something which had once been more important. But it's more likely that Pliny gives only a few picturesque details and passes by the rationale of the ritual. He doesn't tell us who the god of whom he speaks was, perhaps the sun god or the god of vegetation. As to the gift, it was probably in his mind the mistletoe, but it may quite well have meant the gift of growth in field and fold. The tree was perhaps cut down and burned. The oxen may have been incarnations of a god of vegetation, as the tree also may have been. We need not here repeat the meaning which has been given to the ritual, but it may be added that if this meaning is correct, the rite probably took place at the time of the Midsummer Festival, a festival of growth and fertility. Mistletoe is still gathered on Midsummer Eve and used as an antidote to poison or for the cure of wounds. Its druidic name is still preserved in Celtic speech in words signifying all-healer, while it's also called suganderach, sap of the oak, and druidlus, druid's weed. Pliny describes other Celtic herbs of grace. Silago was culled without the use of iron after a sacrifice of bread and wine, probably to the spirit of the plant. The person gathering it wore a white robe and went with unshod feet after washing them. According to the Druids, Silago preserved one from accident, and its smoke when burned healed maladies of the eye. Samolus was placed in drinking troughs as a remedy against disease in cattle. It was culled by a person fasting with the left hand. It must be wholly uprooted, and the gatherer must not look behind him. Vervain was gathered at sunrise after a sacrifice to the earth as an expiation, perhaps because its surface was about to be disturbed. When it was rubbed on the body, all wishes were gratified. It dispelled fevers and other maladies. It was an antidote against serpents, and it conciliated hearts. A branch of the dried herb used to asperge a banquet hall made the guests more convivial. The ritual used in gathering these plants, silence, various taboos, ritual purity, sacrifice, is found wherever plants are culled, whose virtue lies in this, that they are possessed by a spirit. Other plants are still used as charms by modern Celtic peasants, and in some cases the ritual of gathering them resembles that described by Pliny. In Irish sagas, plants have magical powers. Fairy herbs placed in a bath restored beauty to women bathing therein. During the Táin, Cahullin's wounds were healed with balsams and healing herbs of fairy potency, and Dindsenchas used similar herbs to restore the dead at the Battle of Moytura.
And that was Chapter 13 of The Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch. A link to the full text can be found in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not try our sister podcast, the Celtic Myth Pod Show, which brings the stories of ancient Celts to life with narrative and drama, as well as bringing you modern Celtic music, stories and information. Find the Celtic Myth Pod Show in all the places where the best podcasts hang out, or on our website at celticmythpodshow.com.
Before we leave you, we'd like to say a massive thank you and give a shout out to Daniel, Selene and Erica for being patrons of the podcast on our new Patreon page. Thank you so much. Your support is ensuring that we can keep on making these shows. If you'd like to support our continued work on Celtic Tomes, please come and find us on patreon.com/Celtic Tomes. That's patreon.com/Celtic Tomes.
You've been listening to Celtic Tomes, read by Gary and Ruth. Our theme music is Gander in the Pretty Hole by Slauncher, and a link to their music can be found in the show notes at celtictomes.libsyn.com. This podcast has been produced by the Celtic Myth Show.